Who are you? It's arguably humanity's oldest, most frustrating, and honestly most fascinating question. It seems like it should be a simple answer, right? You just say your name, your job, maybe where you're from. But if you strip all those external labels away, what's actually left? Cracking the code of human identity is incredibly complex. It's a puzzle that has literally kept the brightest minds awake at night for thousands of years.
So, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going on the ultimate who am I quest. To really figure out the self, looking through just one window? Yeah, that isn't going to cut it. We need to combine insights from college-level philosophy, sociology, anthropology, and psychology to really piece together the ultimate mosaic of human identity. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to look at 1. The philosophical self, 2. Society's reflection, 3. The cultural blueprint, 4. The psychological mind, and finally, 5. West versus East. Let's dive in. Starting off with number 1, the philosophical self, the mind and the soul. This is really where it all began, with ancient thinkers looking inward to find the core of our being. And wow, our concept of the self has evolved drastically over the centuries. Going way back to ancient Greece, around 600 BCE, Socrates argued that the true self isn't the physical body at all, but the immortal soul. His student, Plato, built on that, claiming this soul actually has 3 parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. Fast forward a bit to the 1600s, and René Descartes totally shifts the focus over to consciousness with his famous "I think, therefore I am." And then, by the 1700s, Immanuel Kant comes along to argue that the mind isn't just a passive observer, it's an active participant organizing all of our experiences. Now, all this history perfectly sets up one of the greatest debates of all time, the mind versus body problem. Descartes championed dualism, basically believing the mind and body are entirely separate, with the mind acting as a sort of ghost in the machine. But contrast that with modern thinkers like Patricia and Paul Churchland. Through neurophilosophy, they argue that the physical brain is entirely responsible for our identity. In their view, there's no ghost at all. The brain literally equals the mind. If your brain's physical anatomy changes, your self changes. Pretty wild to think about. But how do we actually experience this mind? Well, Immanuel Kant had a brilliant realization called transcendental apperception. Okay, I know, don't let the complex term intimidate you. It essentially just means that a unified self must exist for us to even have a memory in the first place. Think about it, if you didn't have a core self tying everything together, waking up every morning would just be this chaotic, flashing jumble of disconnected sensory inputs. The very fact that you experience your life as a continuous story proves that a unified self is sitting right there in the director's chair. Which brings us to number 2, society's reflection, the looking glass. Switching gears from philosophy to sociology, we discover that we aren't just isolated minds floating in a void. We are beings deeply, deeply shaped by the people around us. Sociologist George Herbert Mead showed us exactly how a child slowly builds a self through interaction. At first, in the preparatory stage, infants just imitate others without really understanding what they're doing. Then comes the play stage, where kids start role-playing, pretending to be a doctor or a parent. Finally, usually by age 8 or 9, they hit the game stage. This is when they begin to understand the generalized other, meaning they actually internalize society's cultural norms, beliefs, and rules. The self, as Mead argues, isn't just magically present at birth, it's built layer by layer through society. And this leads us to a concept that might genuinely blow your mind. Just listen to this idea from Charles Horton Cooley. I am not what I think I am not what you think I am what I think you think I am. I mean, wow. Cooley called this the looking glass self. Basically, our identity is a reflection of a reflection. We imagine how we appear to others, we imagine how they evaluate us, and then we develop feelings about ourselves based entirely on those imagined impressions. You are literally shaping your identity based on what you assume everyone else is thinking about you. And because we care so much about this reflection, we engage in what Erving Goffman called impression management. Goffman viewed real life kind of like a theatrical stage. And think about it in your own life. Don't you play a completely different character around your boss than you do around your best friend? Of course you do. You alter your presentation to create a preferred appearance, engaging in what he called face work, to save your image when things get embarrassing. You aren't being fake, you're just performing the different roles that make up your complex social self. Zooming out even further, we hit Section 3, the cultural blueprint, survival and symbols. This is the realm of anthropology, where we examine how our deepest environmental roots mold our identity. The key concept to grasp here is cultural determinism. This is the anthropological belief that human nature has absolutely no universal right way. Instead, who you are is almost entirely determined by the ideas, beliefs, and values you learn in your specific society. Under this theory, we actually have very little control over what we learn. Whether you eat with a fork or chopsticks or even what you consider polite, well, that's all strictly dictated by the cultural blueprint you just happen to be born into.
And this culture really programs us from the outside in. Picture it like a donut. On the outermost, superficial layer, we have symbols, words, gestures, physical objects. Moving deeper, we find heroes, real or fictitious models of behavior we look up to. Deeper still are rituals, those essential social activities we participate in. But at the very core, right in the center of the donut, are our values. These are our unconscious preferences for good or bad, right or wrong. You rarely even think about them, but they are the engine driving your entire cultural self.
All right, let's zoom aggressively back inward for number 4, the psychological mind, mechanics of the internal world. It's time to pop the hood and inspect the nuts and bolts of our internal mental machinery.
Because you simply cannot talk about psychology without talking about the iceberg, right? Freud's psychodynamic theory states that our conscious mind, that tip of the iceberg, is just a tiny fraction of who we are. Beneath the surface, there's a literal war raging. Your id is driven by primal pleasure and instincts, while your superego is up there trying to enforce society's moral rules. Caught right in the middle is your ego, mediating this constant subconscious conflict. Freud essentially believed we are largely a product of our past, driven by repressed energy.
But we have to contrast Freud's idea of this chaotic, built-in subconscious with the philosopher John Locke's concept, which heavily influenced psychology as well. Locke called the mind a tabula rasa, or a blank slate. He argued that we start out as a completely empty hard drive. There are no built-in conflicts or innate ideas. Everything you know and everything you are comes purely from the sensory experiences you write onto that slate as you live your life.
So, as we grow and write on that slate, we develop a self-concept. The psychologist Carl Rogers noted that we actually hold 2 versions of ourselves in our minds. On one side is the real self, your actual current perception of who am I. On the other side is the ideal self, that model version born out of societal standards, answering, who do I want to be? But here's the catch. When your real self and your ideal self drift way too far apart, that creates intense emotional discomfort and often a whole lot of guilt. But hey, the good news is we aren't completely at the mercy of our subconscious or society. Albert Bandura's social cognitive theory suggests that human beings possess human agency. We aren't just passive sponges, we're proactive agents. We show intentionality by acting with awareness. We use forethought by anticipating outcomes. We demonstrate self-reactiveness by regulating our behaviors to hit our goals. And we use self-reflectiveness by looking inward to evaluate our own motivations. We have the self-efficacy to actually change our own path.
Finally, we arrive at number 5, West versus East, the final synthesis. Let's pull back and look at the broadest cultural divide in human history to see how the self operates on a massive global scale. The source material draws a really sharp contrast between 2 global models of identity. On one hand, you have the individualistic self, which is prominent in Western thought and sees the person as highly independent. The focus here is all on individual rights, personal freedom, and really standing out from the crowd. Conversely, you have the collective self, prominent in Eastern and Confucian thought, which sees the self as deeply interdependent. The focus here is on fitting in. In Confucian philosophy, a well-rounded society is achieved when virtuous people operate in harmony. The self is bound by customs, and decisions are made for group unity, not just personal glory. Neither is right or wrong, just fundamentally different ways of building a self. Looking back through all these lenses, philosophy, sociology, anthropology, and psychology, we can definitely find truth in the words of Maurice Merleau-Ponty. The self is an emergent phenomenon in the ongoing process of man's becoming. Your self isn't some static object that you can just put in a box with a neat little label. It is a dynamic, multi-layered masterpiece. It's biological, it's social, it's cultural, and it is constantly evolving as you experience the world. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final, provocative question to chew on tonight. Based on everything we've unpacked, from your brain chemistry to the cultural symbols you use, all the way to the looking-glass reflection of your friends, are you truly the author of your own self, or are you just a character playing a role in society's grand play? Keep questioning, keep reflecting, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explain the fascinating world around us.